Great, thank you very much. Well, today's speaker is Professor Kai-Mei Fu from the University of Washington, who's going to tell us about very interesting things related to quantum defects, maybe the physics and the emerging new defect that she's investigating with her group and possibly some applications. Kai-Mei got her PhD working with Yoshi Yamamoto at Stanford, and then went and did a postdoc working with Ray Beausoleil and some others at HP Labs, doing some really early stage pioneering work, both in quantum defects and in other areas. There's some really great stuff that was done at that lab at that time and other times too. And 2011, she moved to a faculty position at the University of Washington in the physics department and also the electrical engineering department. And she's been quite productive there, building up a world-leading group in this area of quantum defects and other solid-state quantum systems, and pursuing both the physics side of them as well as applications in quantum information processing and in sensing. She's won a number of awards along the way, including an NSF Career Award, a Cottrell Scholar Award, the University of Washington College of Engineering Junior Faculty Award. She's also recently, in the last year or two, become one of the leads of the quantum science and engineering effort there at the University of Washington known as Quantum X. It's got a cool name. And with no further ado, I will give you Kai-Mei Fu, who will tell us about synthesis and characterization of quantum defects from deep centers in diamond as shallow impurities in zinc oxide.
Okay, thank you so much for that nice introduction, Ronald. I heard before the talk that lots of times students don't want to ask questions in this, and now I kind of know why. Alicia just said that we are live Zoom and recording. I'll just let you know, not many people listen to full 1 hour quantum talks all the time on Zoom. We're not probably going to get a million hits. So please don't deter asking questions, because that usually makes the situation at hand much more lively, especially in the remote environment. So just raise your hand or even interrupt. It's a small enough group. So today's talk, I probably will not get to all of this. I will try to keep the talk at around 45 to 50 minutes so we can have some questions. But the overview of the talk is I'm going to give some motivation. Now, this is a JQI talk, so I may go a little fast through the beginning of this motivation, but I still would like to give you some context for why I study defects with respect to quantum information science and technology. The second part of my talk is really because I often give talks, or I used to, and basically at the end of the talk, what people really want to know is how you make them. And so I'm gonna put that up front a little bit about how you make these defects and then how you characterize them, because while the applications are really exciting, the bulk of my work is actually in spectroscopy and characterization of defects. And then I will talk a little bit about the next step, which is integrating these quantum defects into devices, and just one slide on kind of where the landscape is at the end in terms of defect discovery and engineering new defects. Okay, so the main motivation for I would say 4/5 of what my group does is quantum networks, and this is just the image that you get when you look up quantum networks in a Google site. It looks like a network. There's bright spots, perhaps those are nodes, and then there's lines that are connecting them. These are edges or links between these nodes. And because the artist couldn't write superposition states, you just see a bunch of ones and zeros superposed on this artist's rendition of a network. So what we mean by a network is that you have nodes that are connected by links. And these nodes could be very simple, just transmitters that shoot off photons combined with receivers, so just a transmitter and a receiver at each node, or they could also contain a quantum memory, in which case the node becomes much more sophisticated, and this quantum memory type node is what I'm primarily interested in my group. And then the edges or channels, they can also just be a fiber for direct transfer of qubits, a physical entity, or it can represent quantum correlation between the states or entanglement. So if you look at this graph, you can think of this physical infrastructure of qubits connected by fibers, as well as classical channels, or you can think of it more abstractly as a representation of an entanglement network, where quantum information or entangled states are the states at each node are entangled with the states at other nodes. Okay. And the two main applications for this is long distance communication, sometimes dubbed a quantum internet. And then the other one is scaled down to chip level, which is distributed quantum computing. And you can imagine some hybrid of non-distributed and distributed quantum computing, but eventually there do need to be links between processors. The optimal size of each processor, small scale processor, may depend on the physical platform that are being realized. Okay, then for people that just need the snapshot in their head of what actually, so this is node A, this is node B, and this is the link, right? What is that link? The constructive method of creating the link is, for me, the easiest way of understanding what the link is, which is applying a C phase gate to the two superposition states here, and out comes this entangled state. And that is what the link is in the simplest form. And here, if you don't like this gate type methodology, you can just have in your head the unitary matrix in this case for the different states. So this local unit, this state that results is local unitary equivalent to a Bell state. So this is assuming, again, you know, I am going through this quickly, but I'm assuming because it's the Joint Quantum Information or Joint Quantum Institute, I'm going to take some liberty, but please stop me if this is a little fast. This particular state is local unitary equivalent to a Bell state. So at the core of it, you know, if you want this resource, generating Bell states is what you need to do. That's the end goal. Okay. So the way this edge can be created, entanglement can be created in a variety of methods, but the predominant way that it is being pursued with defects is via measurement on emitted photons from these defects. So this is pretty spectacular. It's actually stating that there never has to be any physical interaction between two qubits in order to entangle them, right? What has to happen is that these two qubits do need to be able to interact with an electromagnetic field, right? So this is one example of a protocol to entangle these two qubits. This is not the only protocol, but almost every protocol out there has the same essence, same type of requirements, very similar requirements, and same conceptual ideas behind them. So it is useful to go through what this protocol is and to look at the requirements that we look for when we look at quantum defects. So in general, there has to be a qubit memory state, and these are the 0, 1 states marked here. And then you need at least one optical transition to an excited state. So at the core, we're looking for these types of Hamiltonians for defects. In this type of protocol, what you first do is you initialize into a particular state, 0, and then this vacuum is denoting the electromagnetic field state in this notation. You create a superposition state, say it's a rotation or a Hadamard gate, using typically microwave fields for these two qubits. We're still in a product state. Then you can excite one of these states to an optical transition E. So we're still in this product state. And then you could multiply this out to have 4 possible states, EE, 1E, E1, and 1, 1. I know in my experiment that I am going to only keep states when I get a single click at one detector, which corresponds to only one excited state. And so I'm just prematurely truncating my state based on the final result of only having one photon in the system. The excited state decays via the creation of a photon in either the right or left channels. You go through a beam splitter, and then with the detection of either a left or right photon, so in this particular case, we're detecting a photon in the left channel, you end up with a superposition state, right? So that is a classic protocol, right? So you have to take this mathematics and ask yourself, well, what does that mean for the physical requirements of the system that I want to one day implement something like this on? All right, and so before I say that, what I'll mention is that these types of graphs are actually equivalent, or can be made equivalent. If you can create this graph and do measurements on the graph, it is equivalent to a universal quantum computer. So what do we want for these nodes? And probably your first instinct, and many people that are in atomic physics would say probably maybe their final instinct would be have an atom. Okay. And in the defect community, it's recognized that actually it's the absence of atoms inside of a perfectly periodic array can also create localized states. So the atom that we're working with is a defect state where you can end up with a very similar Hamiltonian as the presence of an atom in vacuum in the case of a crystal. Okay. And then you want to find this particular Hamiltonian or a similar Hamiltonian where you can do the type of protocol that we talked about before. Okay, so this looks easy. Just like in the atomic system, unless you're looking at hydrogen, and you rarely are, and even hydrogen can be a little bit more complicated. This is the actual nitrogen vacancy center energy diagram as we know it. So it has, and this is from decades of spectroscopy work that this picture has come to be, and there's still some open questions as well. So it's a bit more complicated when you give that overview of, all right, we have these 3 levels and we present these 3 levels. What you're trying to do is extract as carefully as possible these 3 levels from something more complicated, and knowing this complicated system as well as possible will help you achieve this goal. Okay. All right, so this is all right. So what are the node requirements? This one, you need to be able to store quantum information. You need to have qubit coherence and a long quantum memory time. And I put this out there to be actually a bit controversial, perhaps. But here, to my knowledge, are the records for 3 different systems. Trapped ions is 60 minutes. Superconducting transmon, I think it's still on the archive, is 0.3 milliseconds. And something that a lot of people outside the defect community don't know, the phosphorus nuclear spin in silicon, its coherence time is 39 minutes. So in all of these systems, they have not shown every single best operation of a qubit, right? These are just the 3 papers that have the longest. Actually, I think there's another one. There's a rare earth one that's hours in a hyperfine level as well. But this 39 minutes was at room temperature, I will add as well. But it shows you for defects in this very, very pure material, if you can get the material of high enough quality, and if you have the right defect, you can get extremely long quantum memory times. And that is what's driving the defect community to work so hard, is knowing kind of these best case scenarios out there. Okay. You need a stable, efficient spin optical interface. This particular phosphorus and silicon defect does not have an efficient optical interface. All right, so that's not going to work. The NV center is the most advanced defect that has shown this in terms of the protocols that have been realized or demonstrated, mainly out of the Delft group. And here you can see photoluminescent spectra of the NV center, where the transition that I'm marking here is actually in a manifold of transitions that is in the zero phonon line here. But actually most of the emission, 97% in the absence of any assistance, is phonon assisted emission, and this actually can't be used. So this is an example of, you take a spectrum, you see, all right, where are we at? We're at possibly 3% efficient if we can collect all the photons. We know what we're working with, but also we're motivated to look for other defects that may not have this weakness. Okay. Multiple qubits per node. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but the scheme I showed you is probabilistic. You can remove or overcome the exponential lack of scaling with a probabilistic system by having multiple qubits per node. Defects have a natural built-in register to help mitigate the scaling issues with probabilistic entanglement schemes. And with the record shown here, which is a register of 10 qubits using carbon 13s with this NV center. Okay. And then the fourth requirement is that they are identical. The defects are identical, but in particular, actually what we want is that the photons that they emit are identical. And to zeroth order, they're identical. This is a good starting point. An NV should be the same as another NV. It has the same structure. These are some other defects: the silicon vacancy, in diamond, the vacancy for a silicon in silicon carbide, and also the rare earth doped crystals. But in practice, they're not. And this is for all defects. There's a microscopic environment that will be different. This is work from my own group looking at nitrogen vacancy centers in small cavities and actually applying voltages to see the different response from all of these defects to applied voltages. This is another one from the De Leon group at Princeton, where actually the defects emissions are very, very stable as a function of time. So time is on this axis, and this is their emission wavelength. But you see that the band here is 50 gigahertz and is only a fraction of the inhomogeneous band of these particular defects. So yes.
This is Bill Phillips. I'm wondering, in the case where things are not stable in time, what is it that's changing?
Yeah. So what is changing in cases where it's not stable in time with the nitrogen vacancy center is the electrostatic environment. So normally, so we see a few things. If you are continuously measuring, that means you're continuously exciting the system. And you only see the nitrogen vacancy center in the lattice, but your optical excitation area is a micron. It is many, 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 many lattice sites. And there can be other defects nearby that are charging and discharging under the very, very high energy photon that you are, impinging on your lattice. So a nearby defect that charges and discharges creates giant electric fields near your defect. And that is going to stark shift the optical emission line.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome. Okay, so we have some challenges that we have a goal: identical defects, strong long coherence, coherent optical transitions that are stable. The nice thing is that we have this compatibility with device integration to both enhance some of the poorer performance that I've alluded to previously, and also long-term allow for scalability. And this is really an eye candy chart, not a true substance slide, just to show you the many different geometries and materials that people in the community are using to try to have strong light defect interactions that can eventually scale in a solid state system. So you can see rare earth dope crystals, diamond, silicon carbide, for example, in these particular slides. Okay.
Can I jump in with a question?
Of
This
course.
is Alan Migdal. So, like, sort of following up on Bill's question, it seems like the lower the density of defects, the more stable your system will be when you find one. Does data actually show that, and how low a density can you get and wind up with that much more stable
That's
site?
right. So, I'm going to defer to that question, Alan, when we talk
Okay.
about making defects, because it turns out to be a
Okay.
little bit more complicated. But actually, the next part of the talk is going to help understand some of this further.
Okay, good.
And so I think we're going to go through the talk a little bit slow, but I think it makes sense, and we'll just abort early for the talk because I love getting questions. Okay, so how do you make these defects? And I'm going to talk about the NV center because it is because it's been studied so much. We have a much better understanding of the NV center than most centers. Because unless there's someone in silicon who wants to talk about doping silicon, then I defer to that person in the audience. So making quantum defects. So the first one is in situ doping during growth. And so here you can see a confocal scan of a bulk diamond substrate, and it's false color, where the color is actually encoding the polarization of the light that's being emitted in this case. And what you can see is that in this kind of slice of a 10 micron thick diamond slice by 50 microns by 50 microns, you can see a handful of defects. All right. So just as a note for most of this talk, just because I go through different defects, up in the right will be the actual defect that I'm talking about because I switch between them. So this is the NV center defect in diamond. Element 6, you buy this. They have a CVD web shop, and they tell you the nitrogen content is 1 parts per billion, or less than 1 parts per billion. And the nitrogen vacancy is, we can measure it because we can just sit and count them. And we know that our measurement volume, we find it's parts per quadrillion. And these are numbers that scare every material scientist out there when you talk about purity levels. When I say it, we suspect that the nitrogen in this particular sample is parts per trillion, it's because we've also done studies where you grow the diamond and you can measure the nitrogen at higher ones, and you can measure the NV center. And so we know the typical incorporation rates for NV centers as a function of like the growth phase of the crystal. So in this particular defect, because we measure 4 parts per quadrillion of NV centers, we expect parts per trillion for the nitrogen, which is very, very pure. There are you asked, like, how pure does it need to be? These are the defects that have been used for all of the quantum information protocols that have come out of Delft. These are the ones that have been incorporated accidentally from leftover nitrogen or nitrogen in the system, unintentional nitrogen in this case. But it's a little complicated because, you know, this is the defects that are that we see, the NV centers, but it's not enough to know what the NV concentration is. Here's a study that we did in my group where we heated the sample up. We just heated it up for a really, really, really long time, an insanely long time. We can talk about it if people are curious what these students did. But what they found was they got more. They didn't do anything. They didn't create more vacancies. They didn't irradiate. They just heated it, which meant that vacancies are coming from something else in the lattice and recombining with these nitrogens, right? There are so many more defects in the crystal than you can possibly see. What is nice is that these defects will be as nice or nicer because you've been annealing for a long time than the defects here. So you don't need this concentration of defects because this is already, these have all these other crappy defects, not crappy, defects that you can't see or utilize yet in there. It's just that we've turned more of them into NV centers in this case. So how pure do you need to be? When you start having defect interactions where one charges and uncharges, for example, I mean, it's nice if it's hundreds of nanometers away. Basically, that's kind of a nice rule of thumb. Similarly, it's nice if it's hundreds of nanometers if you have the super sensitive long coherence times that you want to have for dealing with dipolar interactions to broaden the ground state spins. Okay, and these are very high purities for material growth. Okay, so this is if you just take stuff that's grown in the highest purity material, then but we don't necessarily want to just get what we get, right? The whole point, or one of the big points or advantages of using defects is the idea that we can put them in the material at will, right? And one very powerful way to do that is via implantation and annealing, right? And when you implant the sample, you implant the nitrogen. It doesn't just create the nitrogen, it actually creates a lot of displaced lattice atoms. And then you do an anneal where the vacancies can diffuse. And in this particular case, we end up with an incorrect charge state typically. So we can do another anneal that heals damage at the surface that allows us to stabilize the correct charge state. This gives you a lot of control over placement, but the properties are degraded. This is a nice little picture where you claim to only create, you know, nitrogens and vacancies and leave the rest of the lattice perfect. But to date, the properties of NV centers that have been made in this manner have been measurably inferior to the doped NV centers. Right, so that's the status of the field right now. Okay. Does that help, Bill, a bit to understand kind of? So you can get pretty low densities here. I can get like 1 NV center every micron, but they're still not going to be great because I probably have dye vacancies and surface damage and all other stuff nearby that can wreak havoc on the NV center. Right. And then there's a third method, which I think is really right now being utilized more. It's a rather newer method, which is a combination method where you create the nitrogen via growing it in intentionally. But then you do something else that's less damaging to create the vacancies. And this might be electron irradiation. It might be, it could be carbon. Likely, it actually looks better if it's a very light ion irradiation. You can also use heat or optical irradiation to create vacancies where you want them. So you have the nitrogen everywhere, but then you get the NV centers where you want them. And this is how good can you get with this is still under investigation right now. And this is a really nice review of all the different types of ways to make NV centers down here. Okay. So those are the different ways we make it, but I want to actually have a slight aside, which is once you can look at individual defects, you actually have a very new, powerful tool for understanding how they're synthesized and understanding their properties. And for people doing quantum, that was some parts of this was understood immediately, right? If you have a whole ensemble of defects and you do spectroscopy, everything is blurred by your inhomogeneous line width and that microscopic environment of each little defect. So people have learned so much by being able to look at a single defect with its sharp lines and study each one. But this was a study where we also can look at new kinetics. And what I mean by that is once you look at individual defects, so here is a sample where we have mapped the location of all of these defects in this slice in our crystal, and then we anneal it for 150 hours at 1,000 degrees Celsius, all right? And by doing some image analysis, you can actually determine that there are defects that disappear. There are defects that that appear, and there are also, these are defects that change their orientation. All right, and by orientation in this particular measurement, we can optically, through polarization, identify whether you're one of these two orientations or you're one of these two orientations, where orientation just marks the symmetry axis of the nitrogen and vacancy inside the crystal. And you can take these two and essentially subtract the two images and see all three of these happening at the same time, right? If you were doing an ensemble measurement, you would just measure some average increase or average decrease, but you couldn't see the three different processes happening at different times. And what is interesting about this, being able to see the processes happening, is that they do happen. These different processes are happening simultaneously, but it gives you windows where you see appearances and maybe a lot of appearances. There's actually a window, two windows right here and right here, where we see disappearances. They happen at certain temperatures and certain annealing times. So it's really the temperature that's critical here. And then when you've kind of saturated these disappearances and appearances, what you find is that something new happens that you wouldn't measure at all in an ensemble measurement, which is that these orientations are turning into the orientation above. And so single defect spectroscopy can allow you to see these. And why does it matter? Because we're getting new NV centers from something. There is a vacancy complex that is releasing vacancies at this temperature. And knowing the temperature and when it happens can tell us something about those other defects inside the crystal that exist and what their potential density is. We are losing defects. This loss, we are pretty sure, has to be hydrogen related. It's not that the NV center is dissociating. In fact, at these temperatures, hotter and longer, we don't see any NV centers dissociating, right? It's that hydrogen's coming from somewhere. There's some defect of hydrogen, or the hydrogen's coming in and quenching the NV center. And then we see temperatures where we can see this orientation. And what does that tell us? Well, this is just a model of how does reorientation happen. The vacancy has to actually go to the third nearest neighbor. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It has to go through this stepwise process to reorient. It can't just swap. Turns out there's DFT calculations that show just doing a direct swap takes an awful lot of energy, whereas the vacancy migration that occurs takes a significant less energy. And we can look at where we're observing this and compare it to DFT models, and see whether or not it makes sense. In this case, the R error and the DFT error, both too large. The uncertainties of these potentials are both too large that they actually agree. They do agree. If they didn't agree, it would be awful. But it's telling us at least everything is consistent right now and pushing you to get tighter and tighter bounds in this case. Additionally, a lot of this was motivated by the idea that if you can control this landscape and you can actually see this migration happening. And so we now know we can see this migration happening. And if you can control this landscape via strain, you physically have a path to heat a sample up and cause it to reorient to a single orientation. Right. Okay, so that's how we make it, but then also what we can learn by doing the single defects and how they're forming.
Another quick question.
Mm-hmm.
The bar graph you showed previously didn't seem to have reached steady state to me. If you keep going, what happens?
So we tried so hard to reach steady state. And when people look, if you look at this paper, you'll see that each of these last 3 anneals is 150 hours. So originally when we started with 2-hour anneals. And this was a massive undergraduate experiment where generations of undergraduates would anneal and map. And that was the only way it was possible, right? Because it's just so long. We learned a lot from the study, and we didn't have the heart to go to because you can't just raise the temperature. That's the other thing you learned. As soon as you raise the temperature, another process kicks in. And this is where we got. So the last three points are 450 hours.
Okay.
Yeah. And they only exist for that gold standard of reaching thermal equilibrium.
That's impressive even by NIST standards, right,
Alan? Sure.
Okay. So I'll talk briefly about how we characterize them. There's 2 types of defects that I study in my lab. I think it's important to give a physical picture of both types. One defect is you may sometimes called a Frenkel exciton. Basically, it's a stuck molecule in your atom. The wave functions of the electronic states are confined to lattice spacings. All right, and this is a type of defect that the NV center is, the silicon vacancy center in diamond is, the single vacancy. These are very deep defect levels inside your semiconductor, tightly confined orbitals, and they are studied theoretically using ab initio methods like density functional theory, right? The other type of defect is the Wannier exciton. And this defect is a defect where the localization is spread out over many lattice sites. So on the left is actually the NV center orbitals. On the right is a reconstruction from an STM measurement from a silicon group, and what you see is actually the wave function of a phosphorus donor in silicon in this case. And you can see that it takes many lattice sites. In this particular defect, you use effective mass theory. In fact, it takes the optical properties, many of the properties of the defect actually come from the band structure of the crystal. Okay. All right, and so the way you typically characterize these defects to start with is photoluminescence. And I'm just going to put it out there for people not in the field. It's really hard to identify a new defect from photoluminescence. We go down this rabbit hole sometimes. People send us samples, they want us to look at them, and I can't say no. So I'm like, oh, we'll just pop it in and look at them. It's some type of defect. We don't know what it is, and if you don't know anything, it's very difficult to do this. So here we assume we already know something about a defect. What's really nice about the donors in semiconductors is you have effective mass theory, which means I know the ground states behave like a hydrogen, and I know the excited state has an exciton, an extra electron hole pair combined to this donor. And I know something about the spins of these carriers because I know what semiconductor I'm working with. And so this is an example of photoluminescence from 4 different materials that have neutral donors, and the range of the kind of complex or not so complex, depending on how you're looking at it, level structures that emerge as we go from gallium arsenide, which is a very light, light effective mass. In this case, the effective mass is 0.06, the effective mass of an electron, to zinc oxide, which has an effective mass that is significantly greater, like half the size of an electron mass, and what you can observe in this case. And so we get these, and the goal of getting these spectra is to make that Hamiltonian that we had before, so then we can start doing some coherent spin control. This is just an example from silicon vacancy. It's not my work. So because of time, I'm going to skip it, but you can do this with both types of defects. So then you want to characterize the quantum defects to try to find some effective Hamiltonian. With the NV center in diamond, you can directly drive this transition with microwaves. It's well known where this transition exists. And you can do a spin echo. And this is a case of a 2 millisecond T2 time at room temperature for this particular defect. All done with microwaves, except the readout and initialization is done optically. If you are working with a newer defect, you may need to be probing really different timescales. So this is an example of the gallium donor in zinc oxide, where we're going between this bound donor to this donor-bound exciton state. And this looks like there's 4 transitions that we're going to be utilizing, but actually we're just going to hit the system with one broadband optical pulse. So we will initialize the system. For example, we could initialize by having a narrowband pulse here to put population into state 1, and then we just bang the system with a broadband pulse that actually hits all 4 transitions at once. You can work out the Hamiltonian for this, and you realize it will create a coherence. And then you can measure the evolution of this coherence. So in this particular case, we've done this experiment. And the first thing you can see when you are doing a Ramsey, so broadband pulse, bang, another broadband pulse that you can delay by a small fraction, then you can see that we're probing Larmor frequencies at the particular field we're working at on the order of, sub 10 picosecond timescales in this way. Then you can lengthen your delay significantly and measure the fringe contrast and how that evolves. And here we have 17 nanoseconds. Okay. Then you can put in another broadband pulse in the middle, recover some coherence at the end. So this is a small angle spin echo. And then you can see that we're at 50 microseconds for this ensemble of spins in zinc oxide. But what is the limit in this particular case? You can also remove these and just optically initialize with your narrowband pulse and measure the recovery, do a T1 experiment. This is T1 in microseconds as a function of the spin splitting. So as a function of magnetic field. And these were the 3 materials I studied about 5 years ago. And our understanding of this dependence that you see here pushed us to move to zinc oxide and come up here to the zinc oxide one, where, so now for at least the zinc oxide system, where we are, our spin precessions of 10 picoseconds, optical emission times of a nanosecond, ensemble spin time of 20 nanoseconds, spin echo time of 50 microseconds, and our classical memory time is around 500 milliseconds. And people ask, well, what's good enough? Right? It's like, what do you want? Everyone wants more. I'd like my T2 time to be days, weeks, years. But to be competitive, I would say with other defect systems that are under investigation, is you need a credible goal of reaching a second at this point. You should have a system that you could reach second coherence times, I would say in the electronic states eventually. And this particular system, with the very small spin orbit coupling that exists, indicates right here we're actually limited by the ensemble nature of the measurement, but indicates at least we're not limited by phonons.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
This is Hanan Xiong, and my question is, do you know what's limiting the deterrency, because it's much smaller than the spin echo time? And do you think that would be a problem of this memory?
Yeah, so do I think it's a fundamental problem? No. Is it fundamentally a practical problem? Yes. So when I said that is, remember a few sections back, we talked about NV centers in diamond, and that the material substrate had parts per, trillion impurity levels in that diamond. This zinc oxide is a commercial substrate. It's the best commercial substrate we've ever seen. It's a very special substrate that we have. But the donor concentration alone is well over parts per million. And this is not taking into account, these are not the gallium donors. These are gallium donors, indium donors, aluminum donors, some donors that are of unknown origin, and doesn't include things like oxygen vacancies, zinc vacancies, and other types of materials. So what's limiting T2, we are pretty sure, is interactions with other impurities inside the crystal. One way that we should be able to check it somewhat, right now our spin echo is like we take a hammer and we just smack the crystal, in that our spin echo is a high energy, ultra short optical pulse, right? That's how so it's hitting everything at once and changing everything that it hits at once. We still recover remarkably a lot of coherence doing this, but likely it's limiting our ability to really just manipulate our donor that we're studying and not manipulating other things inside the crystal right now. So we do have ongoing work to get to more pure materials. This is a case in the field where our primary goal right now is to isolate a single donor. That's like a very direct goal that we have, and to study things at the single donor level to motivate the actual investment that would have to occur to get to significantly higher purities. The purity levels in diamond and silicon are so high, but that is the result of an insane amount of investment that you can't do for every single type of material where you think that there's a promising defect at this time.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So where we're going is,
Kai-Mei?
yeah.
Sorry, I had one more question. So this is Alicia. So in the end, you want something that has a very long T1 and a very long T2. But so is there any sense in which having a T1, which is much longer than T2, is actually far more annoying than it is useful? In that, your reset times are extremely long, but your usable processing times are extremely short.
Well, we don't have to wait to reset. That's different, right? So we can reset by optically pumping. And so we don't have that super annoyance, but it does mean that we don't have much reason to measure beyond 500 milliseconds. Right? We're like, it's long enough. We have other stuff on our plate to deal with, but thermally resetting would be super horrible. And if that's what other people are doing, the only reason why they're dealing with it is because they have short enough thermal resets that they can deal with it. If they didn't, then they'd be trying to figure out a way to reset.
Well, the bulk of the conventional NMR and MRI community, that's what they do, right? It's a different field, but they're dealing with T1s that are typically on the order of a second or a sizable fraction of a second, and using thermal polarization. Of course, it's a very successful technology for different applications, but it does, the thing that Alicia's saying, does come up at times if they're T2s or T2 stars are very short, there is a lot of recovery dead time. Yeah.
Yep. What's nice is that even when you can access the nuclear spins in these systems, you access them through the electron spins, so you can still significantly shorten reset times and duty cycles. So right now, what we're implementing in the zinc oxide system is direct microwave control to circumvent some of those issues that we're having with our kind of a hammer optical control. We are looking at zinc oxide donors in single nanowires. They're still small ensembles, but their properties are actually quite nice, and they look quite promising, indicating that a nanoscale environment is possible. We are also, curiously, the indium in zinc oxide emits at almost the same wavelength as ytterbium. So we are also investigating ways to have different types of qubits talk to each other. And this is through photonic engineering of the emitted photon wave packets from the systems. And then another thing that we're looking at is we have very high density of donors with very nice homogeneous properties, and whether or not we can use these as ensemble-based memories. Okay, so this leads us where I'm at, like around time right now, and so sometimes it goes really slow, sometimes it goes really quickly. I'm trying to think. I think I'd like to leave you with one last thing of kind of what can be done and why people are really looking at these quantum defects. And it really is for this nanophotonic defect device integration, and just give you a picture in your head of what people are trying to do. One is, of course, to alter the emission properties of the defect, perhaps reach high cooperativity or strong coupling, and also to realize large networks. And at this point, what we're trying to do is take something that looks like these on the table, optical table experiments, and put them on a chip that might look like the schematic that you see here in this particular case. Okay. In our particular system, there's so many different ways you can fabricate these types of defects. We use a optical layer we transfer to the diamond chip that's made out of gallium phosphide, and then we etch the structure into diamond. And here you can kind of see what nanofabrication can do in terms of making these types of structures. So these are actually cavities that give you Purcell enhancements in the tens or so, but once you have the photon in the cavities, you can actually couple them into the waveguide. This is what a beam splitter looks like on a chip. These right now we're dealing with off-chip grading structures. That's what they look. This is the height of the gallium phosphide that's guiding everything. The other tool that you have now, of course, you have to simulate everything. You can actually simulate with pretty good accuracy what the fields look like in all of these types of devices when you design them. Okay, I'm going to skip experiments. In a wonderful experiment using inverse design photonics that we made, and just say one of the outstanding problems is that once you put the defects in the device, they degrade their quantum properties. And right now, we are working on stabilizing NV centers further. We do have one experiment that is ongoing that I'm happy to talk about in afterwards. We worked significantly on designing structures for centers that are further from the surface. That's these inverse design structures that I skipped over. But then there's a huge field asking, are there quantum defects more resilient to fabrication? And the answer is yes, but there's always a but, or maybe say, and there's a new challenge. So yes, there is. And maybe we'll just leave the end of the talk with this plot from a review article that I was part of, which gives you a feeling for how large the parameter space is of this field, and the absolute need to be able to figure out how to collapse this parameter space, like find out how to search this parameter space, which is going to require advances in theory, advances in formation of defects, and advances in measurement techniques in order to find the defects that will truly be optimal for the types of applications that I'm talking about. Okay, so with that, I'll leave it with the acknowledgements, and I'm happy to take any additional questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kai-Mei. That's great. Super interesting. And there's so much more to talk about too. How do we want to do this, Alicia? Do we want to have questions in the open session before the breakout? How does this work?
Yeah, so typically we start discussing questions in sort of standard format, and then it eventually morphs into a smaller discussion. So the floor is open for questions.
Kai-Mei, this is Glenn.
Hi, Glenn.
Hi, just a kind of technical question, really. I guess I can do the video thing. When you do these long annealing experiments, you're coming back and you're looking in this 50 nanometer spatial window. How do you get back to that spot all the time?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. But what really, all right, so first of all, we just use the corners. The samples has to be completely unmarked, because if you mark up anything with electrodes, I guess you could etch into diamond to make markers. That would have been okay. But most things will just, most markers would not make it to the anneals. So in this case, we had to make sure we didn't anneal so much that the pattern changed too much. So we never would have been able to go from our very first anneal to our final anneal, because actually we increased the density of defects by a factor of 10. That would have been very, very challenging to do. At least it was short until we got the image recognition software working, which requires small number of changes. The second, and by the way, our actual viewing angle was like 500 microns by 500 microns. So it was a huge slice of thousands of defects that were looked at. The second thing is it really helped that there were some larger defects. This is actually a channel defect. And this one really helped us finding this defect that existed over kind of a huge depth. But otherwise, if you know your corners pretty well and you have some dedicated undergraduates, you get back there pretty quickly.
So these are the actual corners of the wafer?
The corners of the diamond.
Yeah,
you measure you measure 3 corners of the diamond, and you measure the top surface, and then you just press go to on your computer and it will go there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Further questions, folks can speak up or put something in the chat. I'll ask one unless there's somebody ready to go. Or 2 aspects maybe.
Go for it.
Okay.
Get
One,
us started.
so many defects, of course, to study. You don't have time to go through everything. Each will have its own distinctive optical properties, which makes a technological challenge, right, in terms of being able to have all the ability to address and read out the appropriate wavelengths. How do you all deal with that? And second question is more on the, I'd like to, could you please tell us a little bit about your interactions with the theorists that you work with and the way in which this operates? How much are you feeding them information and they calculate something? Or is it more the other way in which they're suggesting studies in various areas, or is it more complicated?
Okay, so we have a few collaborations. The collaborations that have all been published have been the kind that I want to veer away from, which is we see this, help us explain this, right? That's the standard theoretical collaboration. So if you see all my work on effective mass theory, we have a strong collaboration with Misha Glassov's work group at Yaffe Institute to explain this. it's funny though, we have so many differences. They never, you would think in classic semiconductors and spin relaxations, it would just be easy, but it's not. We have different magnetic field dependencies to start with, and we go back and forth, and they ask us if our experiment's wrong. We ask if their theory's wrong, like if we're missing something. So actually each paper that has a strong theory, we just had one come out on acceptors and gallium arsenide. Each paper that is easy, we may take the data for a year, but typically working with the theorists, it will take us a full another year before the paper comes out. So each time you see one of those papers, it is between 2 to 3 years of back and forth with theory. Now for the DFT type work, we are working with a theorist now. The way that's often working is they're giving us a bunch of candidates to look at, and we're not growing them yet. It's ongoing, but we're basically looking for, because they don't know like what's a good optical lifetime that will actually enable us to measure it. So we have to narrow it down. They do a screening of 100 defects, and we're like, that one is not going to give us enough photons. That one's outside any band that I have in the lab. Right. And so that's what's going on right now with that collaboration, is really narrowing it down. And we expect there'll be a couple theory papers that come out, but actually getting to the experimental part is taking some time. In terms of so many wavelengths that we look at, it's different than being in an atomic physics lab. Where not only is it like just a few wavelengths, it's like you're trying to find it within, 10 kilohertz.
Right.
I'm working with Boris Blinov's lab, and we're working both at 369, and our meetings are really funny that we have together of the troubles that we're having. Diode lasers has really, the advent of diode laser technology has really changed things. For if you know there's a promising defect, you do above band PL on it, then you know where you need to go for resonant excitation. Then for about $30,000 to $50,000, you could buy a source. I mean, it sounds like a lot. It is a lot, but it's not like the source doesn't exist and you have to make it. So for many things in the diode band. Then for RF, that can be a lot harder. And that's where it really actually helped us to have that broadband technique that we developed, because you just need an ultra short pulse to create some coherence. And then you can see the spin precession in this case.